I wanted to attempt to answer the question, what happens after enlightenment? As if I know. Although in a sense we all know. It does, of course, depend on definition. Let's just simplify it to realizing who we are beyond our human identity. So once it's revealed to us, there are a number of implications. Of course, those implications also depend on the depth of the realization. It's not obvious to me that everyone's enlightenment is exactly the same. In fact, it seems pretty clear that there's a lot of variability. And the ways in which the self can be revealed to each individual is as varied as each individual. And often the implications aren't obvious right away. It seems to be the case that often the realization is so stunning and so staggering that there's sort of an after effect. And the quality of being stunned kind of lasts for a while. And that's usually an indication that you've had a profound realization. There's some carryover. But when it happens, there's often a feeling that everything's okay. And in fact, everything always was okay. And so maybe the implications don't seem important, or they don't come up. Because if everything's okay and everything's always been okay, everything always will be okay, then what does it really matter? And in a sense that's true. It doesn't really matter. But there is a big but. That is, you're still in a human body, and there are practical implications. to that. You still have an ego. That's one thing that some teachings seem to hint at the fact, or maybe even overtly say that, when you're enlightened, you have no ego. When you're in an acute state of profound realization, it might be permissible to say that there's no ego. But after that, that's a totally different story. So we have the acute moment of realization in a time, in a place, and there's a happening, there's a circumstance there. The realization arrives in time and space, and there's the experience of that timelessness while in a certain time and space. And then there's a taper off, and then you're back to relatively normal consciousness and awareness. It's you're normal everyday life. Now maybe it's a different you, fundamentally. Well, not fundamentally. Fundamentally, you're the same. But on a more superficial level, you might be completely different because of the experience. The reality is the ego always comes back. And that's fine. That's okay. It's kind of pointless to resist the ego. The ego has a lot of good qualities. It's there to help us. The ego is a companion. But, there are some caveats to having an ego. If you're a human, you almost certainly have one. But really, the one caveat is that the ego is a great servant, but a horrible master. And so if that's recognized, then the ego can be used like a tool. Do not try to get rid of your ego. And again, this is all based on definition. Some people might say they have no ego. I say bullshit, frankly, but, again, it's all definition, and it doesn't really matter anyway. But what happens at the point of realization is that, this is my perception, is that often what people experience, the human experience is saturated in suffering. For most of us, we experience a lot of pain from the time of birth to the time of death. And there isn't just one ego. It appears to me, and this is only a matter of speaking, is that we sort of go through one after another over time. The ego is this personality that has its thoughts and views and expectations about reality, and they're based on certain beliefs. But as we continue to live our life, information is fed into our sensorium that may contradict those those thoughts and those beliefs and those expectations. And so the ego becomes, it becomes dysfunctional. And so there's a period in which it's starting to cause as much pain and suffering as it is getting you by from one day to another. Once it starts to collapse, then that seems to precipitate an experience of realization. There's a strong, open channel of awareness that is revealed. But because of that perception, but because of that awareness, what happens is a new ego arises as a result. And I would say that it's a more functional ego. It's more resilient, and it's better grounded in the new perception of reality. So it includes all of the past experience. The new ego recognizes the past experience. It sees the transformation. And now it says, okay, going forward, now we know this, this, and this, all these things, all these thoughts and beliefs about reality, and this is the best way to conduct ourselves moving forward. The ego is constantly rebuilding itself all the time, in a sense. But as I explained, there are these acute moments where there's a moment of destruction and rebirth, in a sense. Some people refer to that as ego death. And it is kind of like a death. Because there's a personality, a group of traits and beliefs that just vaporize in the face of that realization. So the implications are dependent upon the depth of your realization. Because again, to me, enlightenment is not an all or nothing thing. It scales. Some people might not want to hear that, but that's what I see. One thing to recognize is that anyone's thoughts and assertions about enlightenment, or the ego, or spirituality, consciousness, any of these topics, these are only the teacher's biases. And this leads us into the implications of enlightenment. That is that if we know ourselves to be unbounded, unlimited potential, then really the choice is up to us. What comes next? The choice is up to you. What comes next? How much of that you're willing to accept, how much of that you can tolerate, that is up to you. It is a lot. Make no mistake, it's a lot. If we accept that we are unbound consciousness and infinite potential, that's a lot for the human to bear. And that if it is poorly tolerated, if the realization is poorly tolerated, then it can lead to what has become colloquially known as the dark night of the soul, which is just another term for, or phrase for depression, basically. Existential depression, which is very common. This idea of enlightenment as just this, this point in time, now I'm egoless and I have, I've realized my non-dual nature, and now I'm happy all the time. It's, I don't know, maybe it's like that for some people, but that's not my experience. It's the experience only deepens after that. It's just, there's so much more to unravel after that. It's such a mystery, but it's also very exciting. It's very, very exciting. And even when I do these, relatively long videos, I mean, there's so much more that I can touch upon. The implications are just like, what happens after death? What happens when you realize who you are? What happens once the physical body dies? That's another, could be another 10 videos just about that. But ultimately, when the realization happens, the implication is that you decide what happens next. Because you're the author of the story. And the challenge is fitting all of that into this human incarnation. It's a process. When the realizations are deep enough, we're provided certain gifts. One thing I've noticed is that after realization, it's easy to pick out the symbolism in stories, like in books or movies, things like that. They become so fascinating, and they jump out at you. Well, they jump out at me. And that's because stories are you see that every story is just the story of you. So every story you just reflect. You're just reflecting on yourself. And every character, you're the main character in every story. And for that matter, you're the protagonist, the antagonist, you're the plot, you're every piece of the story. A story is this. Simplified, of course. A man leaves home to go on a journey. Then he comes back home from the journey, changed. And that's it.